Welcome to another episode of Mike Reads. Tonight we'll be continuing in our series on Thomas Sowell's Economic Facts and Fallacies with our third read in Chapter 2. Chapter 2 is entitled Urban Facts and Fallacies. Like I've mentioned previously, we're doing this as a parallel read with Henry Hazlitt's Economics in One Lesson, so I'll put a link to that series in this video's description. As I've also mentioned, at the end of each of these reads, I'll be doing an analysis and review of the read. So if you want to go ahead and just jump to the analysis and review, please check the timestamps in this video's description, because I'll break this video up by its sections and subsections. Speaking of which, today's read is going to begin the section of Chapter 2 entitled Urban Economic Activities. It's a very long read, so what I've decided to do is break it up into two reads. Today we're going to read the introductory section of Urban Economic Activities, and then we'll continue on into the first subsection, which is entitled Slums and Crime. And then in the next read, we'll finish up the section by reading the second subsection, which is entitled, bear with me here, folks, Urban Sprawl. And then we'll finish up the chapter with, in that next read, with the summary and conclusions section. So hopefully that hasn't confused everybody. Like I said today, to keep it simple, in the third read here in Chapter 2, we're just going to read the first half of the section entitled Urban Economic Activities, and we'll continue on in the next read in this book by finishing off this section and finishing off the chapter. So, in case you, so for those of you who have not lost your train of thought here, let's just dive right into the read on urban economic activities. Cities are not only places where people consume various benefits, they are places where many of these benefits are produced not only for their own inhabitants, but also for people in the hinterlands and around the world. These goods and services are distributed both through markets and through political processes, the two processes operating under very different incentives and very different constraints. Cities reduce the costs of some things and increase the cost of others. The high fixed costs of building reservoirs, hospitals, or electric power lines can be spread over vast numbers of people living in a limited urban area, reducing the cost per person compared to what it would cost per person to supply the same things in a population more thinly spread over vast countrysides. There are other ways in which a city reduces production costs. The wide variety of economic activities taking place within city limits mean that complementary resources are more readily available nearby, which is to say, at lower transportation costs in both time and money. A manufacturer with a complicated machine that breaks down is more likely to quickly find someone qualified to repair it in a big city, thereby reducing the time during which that machine is unable to operate. Other kinds of costs are greater rather than less in a city. The disposal of sewage, for example, seldom requires as high a cost per person in a thinly populated countryside as in a city. In the country, human wastes, as well as discarded food, can be left to be absorbed by the land as these wastes decompose. Rivers and streams can also safely absorb limited amounts of sewage and discarded food from a small population spread over a wide area. The human race could not have survived for thousands of years if every trace of impurities were fatal. But the human waste and discarded food from 1 million people living in a 50 square mile area cannot be absorbed by the land or water as fast as it is created. Without building costly water supply systems and costly sewage systems, the water will quickly become too dangerous to drink and perhaps even too dangerous to wash with. Much of the urban land, being paved over, has even less capacity to absorb the wastes, so that discarded garbage alone is a deadly menace to public health unless there are costly systems in place to keep collecting and disposing of it outside the city. Crime control can also be more costly per person in a city, where the anonymity of vast numbers of people can enable criminals to more readily escape detection than in a small community where most people know one another, and a stranger stands out like a sore thumb. In such small communities, personal ties make witnesses more likely to come forward after a crime or even to intervene while crimes are being committed. In short, The crime control exercised by both citizens and police in a small community, the former free of charge to the taxpayers, is more likely to be left more heavily in the hands of the police in an urban community where people are much less likely to intervene or even to come forward as witnesses. Particular close-knit urban neighborhoods, where many people are relatives or longtime friends, may have some of the low crime control costs of a small community. Moreover, even strangers living in such communities or neighborhoods benefit from the fact that criminals know that such places are not promising places for committing crimes. But seldom will a whole city enjoy such an advantage. Urban residents must therefore pay more for police protection because deterrence or intervention by ordinary citizens is less available. Urban residents in low-income neighborhoods often also pay more for ordinary grocery items or other common purchases from drugstores, hardware stores, and other merchants. One reason is that it is often not economically realistic to locate large supermarkets or big box retail stores with economies of scale in such neighborhoods. What this means is that the stores that do locate in low-income neighborhoods have higher operating costs that will be reflected in higher prices. It is cheaper to deliver a huge amount of merchandise to one gigantic Walmart store than to deliver the same amount of merchandise to a dozen or so smaller stores scattered around town. While it is economically feasible to locate a gigantic Walmart store in Page, Arizona, a community of about 7,000 people, it would not be feasible to locate a Walmart in a low-income urban neighborhood of 7,000 people. What makes the Walmart in Page, Arizona economically viable is that it is located on a highway from which customers arrive from places far beyond the small town of Page, and that there is a vast parking lot on which customers can park in a place where building such parking lots is feasible because land prices are nowhere near what they would be in a city. Not only are people in low-income urban neighborhoods less likely to have cars, the stores there are unlikely to be able to afford the land prices required to build huge parking lots for cars if they did have them. Moreover, if this low-income neighborhood is also a high-crime neighborhood, people from outside the neighborhood are less likely to shop there as people from far beyond Page, Arizona, drive to its Walmart. Crime and violence affect the local economy more directly when riots destroy many or most of the businesses there, and new businesses are afterwards reluctant to move in to replace them. As already noted, in just one decade, the 1960s, riots in Chicago's West Side destroyed or forced the abandonment of an estimated 3/4 of that neighborhood's businesses. Thus, inhabitants of low-income neighborhoods, most of whom are neither criminals nor rioters, end up paying higher prices because of those among them who are. There is no need to attempt to determine the net effect of cities on costs in general. First of all, there is no such thing as costs in general. There are particular costs that matter differently to particular individuals and enterprises, and those individuals and enterprises can weigh for themselves the various costs and benefits that affect them. The assumption that third-party observers can make better decisions than people directly involved has produced many urban fallacies and many economic and social disasters. The belief that third parties with no stake in the outcome are empowered, morally as well as politically, to override the decisions of those who do have a stake in the outcome has been institutionalized in quote-unquote city planning studies at universities, in quote-unquote smart growth laws and policies, and in various crusading movements to stop quote-unquote urban sprawl or to cure neighborhood blight, as third parties choose to define these terms. Slums and Crime. One of the oldest urban fallacies was at one time summarized in the phrase, quote, "Slums are nurseries of crime," end quote. Physically run-down neighborhoods have often had much higher crime rates than neighborhoods where more affluent people have had newer and more upscale housing. However, as statisticians have long pointed out, correlation is not causation. Moreover, even where causation is involved, that does not determine the direction of causation. Do bad physical surroundings promote bad behavior, or does bad behavior cause physical surroundings to deteriorate and prevent people from earning higher incomes that would enable them to live in better surroundings. For well over a century, the prevailing view behind much government policy has been that bad physical surroundings promote crime and other activities detrimental to society and to the individuals who engage in these activities. From this belief have followed massive and costly government programs to demolish slums or quote-unquote blighted areas and to relocate individuals from those areas into either newly built government housing projects or to scatter individuals and families from bad neighborhoods into good neighborhoods. Whatever the merits of the belief in the causal role of physical surroundings as a hypothesis to be tested empirically, its role in the real world has not been that of a hypothesis, but rather of a belief seldom tested against facts and even resistant to facts. In Jane Jacobs' classic book on urban life, The Death and Life of Great American Cities, she recalled visiting a Boston working-class neighborhood called the North End and then discussing it with a city planner she knew. The North End had been settled by poor Italian immigrants, and, like many neighborhoods inhabited by people struggling to get started, it was initially very crowded and run down. Over time, however, as these Italian Americans and their offspring began to find their way in the American economy and society, the neighborhood changed for the better, as many people were able to afford to move out, relieving the crowding, and those who remained behind began to upgrade their homes by remodeling and adding new amenities. Third-party observers, however, could not see those improvements that took place behind the walls of these people's homes, much less the improvements in the people themselves as they adjusted to American life and norms. When Jane Jacobs phoned a city planner friend and told him of her excursion into the North End, he asked, "Why in the world are you down in the North End?" He declared, "That's a slum." Then followed this exchange between them. I'm going to add in names here, folks. Jane, "It does not seem like a slum to me," I said. So that would be Jane. The city planner, "Why, that's the worst slum in the city. It has 275 dwelling units to the net acre. I hate to admit we have anything like that in Boston, but it's a fact. Jane, do you have any other figures on it?" Planner, "Yes, funny thing. It has among the lowest delinquency, disease, and infant mortality rates in the city. It also has the lowest ratio of rent to income in the city. Boy, are those people getting bargains. Let's see. The child population is just about average for the city, on the nose. The death rate is low, 8.8 per thousand, against the city average of 11.2. The TB rate is very low, less than 1 per 10,000. Can't understand it. It's even lower than Brookline's. In the old days, the North End used to be the city's worst spot for tuberculosis, but all that's changed. Well, they must be strong people. Of course it's a terrible slum. Jane, you should have more slums like this." In short, the hard facts contradicted the assumptions of the city planner and of city planners in general. Yet his only response was to regard these facts as isolated anomalies, something funny, something he can't understand, as compared to housing statistics that he used to define as slum. Like many other educated professionals, he was unlikely to consider the possibility that these less educated, working-class people had achieved something that was both worthwhile and a contradiction of the prevailing doctrines among city planners and other professionals. To the powers that be, the North End was simply a slum, and one that needed to be demolished. Nor was this kind of thinking peculiar to Boston. It appeared on the national level as far back as the administration of Herbert Hoover, and was developed further during the subsequent New Deal administration of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, as Jane Jacobs pointed out. Quote, Herbert Hoover had opened the first White House conference on housing with a polemic against the moral inferiority of cities and a panegyric on the moral virtues of simple cottages, small towns, and grass. At an opposite political pole, Rexford G. Tugwell, the federal administrator responsible for the New Deal's Green Belt demonstration suburbs, explained, quote, "My idea is to go just outside centers of population, pick up cheap land, build a whole community, and entice people into it. Then go back into the cities, and tear down whole slums and make parks of them." End quote. The demolition of any neighborhood will of course destroy not only the physical structures of that neighborhood, but also the human relationships that make it a viable community, as its inhabitants are scattered to the wind. The idea that third-party observers have both the right and the duty to arrange other people's living conditions differently from the way that those people have arranged these conditions themselves was not even peculiar to the United States. Various European countries have carried this belief even further. What made such massive government rearrangement of people's homes and lives possible in the United States, despite the Constitution's protection of private property, was the power of eminent domain granted by the Constitution to allow private property to be taken for quote-unquote public use by the government, presumably for such things as building reservoirs, bridges, or highways. Even so, the government was supposed to pay, quote, just compensation, end quote, for the property seized. However, expansive judicial interpretations of such constitutional provisions in more recent times have given increasing leeway to government officials to seize private property for an even wider range of reasons, including, quote unquote, urban redevelopment. Requirements for just compensation to property owners when their property is seized by government are by no means always honored. Appraisers hired by government officials obviously have a conflict of interest when they know that making high or low appraisals can affect whether they will be hired again in the future. Even with honest and objective appraisals, the very fact that the government has threatened to use its power of eminent domain to destroy and redevelop a given area means that the market value of properties in that area will fall. Prospective home buyers are less willing to buy in neighborhoods that are scheduled to be torn down. Banks become less willing to lend to homeowners or businesses in that area, so even if the area was not blighted before, the unavailability of loans to maintain or upgrade local homes and businesses means that these homes and businesses can be expected to deteriorate faster than usual during the years that can pass between the time when redevelopment plans are announced and the time when the threat of demolition through eminent domain hanging over them is eventually carried out. More fundamentally, however, what the government compensates for is the value of what they take, not the value of what the property owner has lost. When the owners of small businesses like restaurants, barbershops, or hardware stores own a building where these businesses are carried on, they have typically invested not only in acquiring a building, but also have invested years of effort in developing reputations and contacts that continue to build their clientele. Moreover, their clientele may over the years become far more valuable than their building. Yet when the government decides to level that part of town and replace existing homes and businesses with some new redevelopment, it compensates the owners of these businesses only for the value of the physical structure, not for the often much larger value of the loss of their clientele, who are now scattered to the wind by mass evictions. Property owners are not the only people who lose when forcibly displaced to make room for redevelopment, and financial losses are not the only losses. For example, a study of people who had been displaced from a close-knit community in Boston found about half of them disturbed or depressed. While many of them found better housing elsewhere, 86% of them paid higher rents than before they had been forced out of their former neighborhood. These particular displaced people were white. Other studies show even higher proportions of displaced blacks suffering the same emotional reactions, and even higher proportions of their incomes now being required to pay rent in their new homes. For displaced people in general, one study concluded that, quote, the average uncompensated loss which each is compelled to suffer amounts to the confiscation of from 20 to 30% of 1 year's income, end quote. The rationale for transferring people and resources is that what ends up being built is more valuable than what was torn down. If this is true, then it should be possible to completely compensate the losers for their losses and yet have enough left over for the new users to be better off as well. But if the compensation paid to the losers covers only a part of their losses, then government redevelopment plans, which create more losses than benefits, are still viable, both economically and politically, because they are heavily subsidized by the unwilling victims of eminent domain. Put differently, those who plan and carry out such redirection of resources and people have incentives to exercise their authority far beyond the point where there is any net benefit to society. Many of the costs of these disruptions of communities would be difficult to tabulate for compensation, even if the authorities wish to do so, since it is difficult to put a price tag on disrupted human relations, which can include an increased susceptibility of crime when informal community constraints are lost as the people are scattered. Perhaps the clearest indication of these costs are the prices that would have to be paid to get people to voluntarily relinquish their homes and businesses instead of having them seized by government through the power of eminent domain. Behind much of this governmental activity to redirect people and resources is the implicit assumption that social problems in general, and crime in particular, will be reduced by removing people from bad physical surroundings to the kind of physical surroundings that third parties consider better. That assumption need not be tested by planners, politicians, bureaucrats, or judges, because seldom will any of these have to pay any price for being wrong. Nor are they likely to have the kind of intimate knowledge of the lives, values, and behavior patterns of the very different people whom they are moving about like pieces on a chessboard to carry out some grand design. Given the incentives and constraints at work, it can hardly be surprising that attempts at reducing crime by destroying slums have so often proved not only futile, but even counterproductive. Time and again, moving slum dwellers into brand new public housing projects has only created new centers of crime in those projects. The new buildings have rapidly deteriorated into new slums. Widely praised designs for projects, like the Pruitt-Igoe projects in St. Louis, have ended up such abject failures in practice that they have to be dynamited. But while such projects have been demolished, the assumptions behind those projects have not been demolished. They continue on in still more schemes based on similar assumptions, such as housing vouchers to enable slum dwellers to go live in middle-class communities, in utter disregard of the years of sacrifice that the people in those middle-class communities may have made precisely in order to be able to afford to go live away from the hoodlums and criminals now being placed in their midst by government programs. The Chicago area has been typical. Quote, in southern suburban Chicago, with one of the highest concentration of voucher holders in the country, middle-class African-American residents complained that they thought they'd left the ghetto behind, only to find that the federal government is subsidizing it to follow them. End quote. Among the consequences have been, quote, the small signs of disorder that come with voucher tenants, end quote, such as lawns that don't get mowed, quote, shopping carts left in the street, end quote, unsupervised children, and boomboxes playing late at night. None of this is peculiar to the Chicago area. Similar complaints about voucher tenants have inundated local officials in Philadelphia and in suburban communities in Prince George's County, Maryland, and Riverdale, Illinois. Voucher tenants often, quote, do not pay their utility bills or the required 30% share of the rent, end quote, in Prince George's County. In Riverdale, a school, quote, once boasting a top academic reputation, end quote, has seen its achievement levels drop, refuting, quote, the idea that shipping poor families to good schools in the suburbs will cause an education ethic to rub off, end quote. Similar results followed an unplanned experiment that took place after Hurricane Katrina struck New Orleans in 2005. The city of Houston took in more than 100,000 people who had fled New Orleans in the wake of that hurricane. These were people whose household incomes averaged only about half of the incomes of existing Houston residents, people whose children did less well than other children in Houston schools, and people from a city whose murder rate was almost 4 times that in Houston. Their transfer to Houston was followed by a sharp increase in Houston's crime rate, especially murder. Whether moving people into government housing projects, giving them vouchers to subsidize their living in middle-class neighborhoods, or moving large numbers of them from one city to another, The evidence is clear that changing people's location does not change their behavior. Yet the implicit assumption that it does continue to Yet the implicit assumption that it does continues to dominate social thought and government policy, both shaped by people who seldom live in the places to which problem people are moved and who pay no price for being wrong. On the contrary, what would cost them dearly in both personal and career terms would be admitting that they were wrong, that they had disrupted thousands of lives and wasted billions of taxpayer dollars. All right, that concludes tonight's read. On to the analysis and review. All right, welcome to the analysis and review part of the video. Okay, so this is going to be kind of short because there really isn't much to talk about, and I kind of want to try to limit myself here since the read itself was pretty doggone long. So there's really only two major takeaways to get out of this chapter, and one is pretty much just a reinforcement of one of the lessons we got out of our very first read in chapter 1. I believe it was page 7 that he mentioned the fallacy of composition, which is basically that, you can take the boy out of the hood, but you can't take the hood out of the boy in this case. So when you just take people and you just move them from one place to the other, you haven't changed the person. All you've done is change their location. And he explains this pretty succinctly on page 45 when he says, whether moving people into government housing projects, giving them vouchers to subsidize their living in middle-class neighborhoods, or moving large numbers of them from one city to another, the evidence is clear, and this is the important part, that changing people's location does not change their behavior. And we know that from what we know about, he only briefly mentions crime and housing projects. So if you take people who are prone to criminal activity, the physical location in which they're conducting that criminal activity is not affected by a change in that physical location. Does not affect the actual crime rate. So if you take, say, like 100 people and 10 of them are serial killers or whatever, if they're serial killers here, they're going to be serial killers here. And that's actually a truism that's pretty well evidenced in things like, he mentions the Pruitt-Igoe projects in St. Louis. And that was a perfect example of how the place was regarded as a slum, at least from an aesthetic standpoint. And then they built up this new housing projects to replace the quote-unquote slum housing projects that existed before. And they were like, they had the greatest of amenities. They were, an architectural wonder, if you will, of the modern world when they first came out, and it took all of 2 or 3 years for them to be immediately returned to slums. And I think anyone who's had a roommate understands how this works. If the roommate is just a slob, then moving them to a nicer apartment isn't going to make them any less of a slob. No matter how many times you move with your roommate, and I've had these before, where no matter how many times we move together, if they're a slob, they're just a slob. And they need to change their behavior for them to not be slobs. And that's just a fundamental characteristic of human nature. And it's evidenced every time that you see something like the quote-unquote improvement of or redevelopment of housing projects. The other thing that he mentions in brief, and I think this is a really important point to make in general, even though he kind of makes the point in passing, is that we've all heard that correlation is not causation. Well, the correlation-causation fallacy actually has a second half to that, and that is that, yes, correlation is not proof of causation, but even where you've managed to suss out causation, what's important is the direction of causation. For example, does crime cause high prices in when it comes to bodegas and high crime areas, or does high prices cause the crime? And I think it's pretty obvious from even this chapter, and he goes into more detail later on in this book about crime statistics and how if you have a high crime area, of course, prices of goods and services are going to reflect that higher level of crime, which means that they have to devote more resources into dealing with that. So obviously prices are going to increase. And I think that's a really important distinction to be made. Just in brief, I'll read the passage where he makes that point to make it clear. That's on page 40. It actually starts on page 39. It just starts actually with one word on page 39. So let's just skip over that. Moreover, even where causation is involved, that does not determine the direction of causation. I've actually done a lot of debates in my time, and this is a serious flaw that people just don't understand. That is the second half of the correlation causation fallacy. So if you ever get into a debate with somebody, this is an important thing to remember and an important thing to point out to them when they are looking at if they're trying to evidence something statistically. First thing first, is there a correlation? Second thing, does the correlation actually indicate causation? And is the causal link between A and B actually that A causes B or that B causes A? So something to bring up, something to keep in mind. Really, everything else in the chapter was fairly self-explanatory. He doesn't get quite hot, as this is a pretty mundane chapter in my opinion. So the more hot button, the more interesting chapters are here to come. And the next chapter is going to be a bit of a doozy, and I really love the next chapter. And in fact, the takeaways that we've gotten from this read get expanded upon in the next read that we'll be doing in this, which is going to close chapter 2. And then of course where things really, really get fun. I think the book's actually done pretty well so far. But where things really, truly get interesting is in chapter 3. So stay tuned for that. That should be coming out, not in the next read, but in the one after that in Thomas Sowell. Of course, we're doing this as a parallel read with Economics in One Lesson by Henry Hazlitt. So, it might be a little while before we get to that. So something to look forward to. Hope you guys have enjoyed the read. Hope you guys have gotten something out of this analysis and review. And we'll see you in the next one. Night, folks.